All right, so get this. We're going deep today. Unmasking the, well, not exactly puppet masters, but kinda. We're diving into the EU's quest to expose beneficial ownership.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, it's way more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah, for
Your
sure.
guide for this deep dive, this Moody's FAQ document we have, and it's full of surprises. Seriously.
It's like, you're peeling back layers of these companies, these partnerships, just to find the person, the actual human who's really in charge.
Exactly. We're not just talking about who owns the biggest chunk of a company. It's about who's actually benefiting from what the company does, right?
Right.
And the EU's shaking things up big time with this thing called the Sixth Anti-Money Laundering Directive.
AMLD6.
AMLD6, yeah, exactly. I know, acronyms can be a bit much.
It can be.
But trust me, this directive's got some serious power behind it. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, AMLD6, it's all about making things tougher for people trying to hide, shady stuff behind these complicated company structures. One of the biggest changes, a standard definition of beneficial ownership across, all the EU countries. It's not just who has the most shares anymore.
So you're saying someone could own, a tiny sliver of a company, but still be the one calling the shots?
Exactly. And that could be tricky to track down for sure.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare to unravel.
It can be. So the directive sets a bar, generally 25% ownership, to be considered a beneficial owner. But there's more to it.
Okay, there's always more to it, right?
Right. Because control, it could be a lot more subtle than just owning shares. Think veto rights, having the power to appoint key people, even sometimes family ties.
Huh, interesting.
Even with less than 25% ownership, you could be blocking decisions, influencing who gets those important positions, basically pulling the strings from behind the scenes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But wouldn't this, having a clear definition like this, wouldn't that also make it easier for the people who are trying to, skirt the rules?
It's a good point.
Yeah.
If everyone knows about this 25% threshold, can't they just structure things so they own just under that and fly under the radar?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and it's a constant game of cat and mouse. Whoever's writing these regulations has to be thinking ahead, anticipating how people might try to get around them. So AMLG6, it tries to address this by focusing on what they call control via other means.
Right, we touched on that a bit ago, but how do investigators even begin to untangle that web of influence? Especially when you're talking about companies that operate all over the world, maybe even using shell corporations and stuff.
It's super complex, no doubt, and AMLD6 knows this. So for certain industries, they lower that ownership threshold to 15%. High-risk sectors, they call them.
Okay.
Think finance, gambling, any area where money laundering is already a big concern.
So basically, they're casting a narrower net in those industries because the stakes are higher. Gotcha.
Exactly.
But even then, how do you track down those, those puppet masters, the people who might not even show up on any official paperwork? It seems impossible.
Well, that's where things get really, really interesting. The EU has these things called registers of beneficial owners.
Okay.
Think of them like databases. They hold all the important information about who's actually in control. Names, birth dates, nationalities, the whole 9 yards.
So it's like a directory of who's pulling the strings. That's got to be a huge help to investigators, right?
Yeah, for sure. And journalists, even just curious citizens. Well, it was supposed to be that open, but
Yeah.
there's been a recent ruling from the European Court of Justice threw a bit of a wrench in things.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, they raised concerns about, the potential for this information to be misused and what it could mean for people's privacy.
So no more unlimited public access, but then who can access these registers now?
Mainly, it's limited to, official authorities, law enforcement, financial intelligence units, those kinds of folks. They need it for investigations.
Makes sense.
Then there are what they call obliged entities.
Obliged entity.
Yeah, these are organizations that are legally required to, do their due diligence on their clients.
Okay, so banks, financial institutions, that sort of thing.
You got it. But it goes way beyond that.
Hold on, who else are we talking about here?
Okay, this is where it gets wild. We're talking crypto asset providers, dealers in high-value goods.
Yeah.
Think art, luxury cars, and get this, even professional football clubs.
Wait, football clubs? Seriously?
Serious?
So are we picturing some star striker being investigated for what, some shady transfer deal or something?
It's not that far off.
Wow.
Think about the sheer amount of money in pro sports. It's ripe for exploitation, let's just say that.
Yeah.
So bringing them under AMLD6, it kind of makes sense?
Yeah, it does. I never thought I'd hear, football and anti-money laundering in the same sentence, but it does kind of show how widespread this whole issue is.
Yeah, it really does.
So, with all these obliged entities suddenly needing to get up to speed on this whole beneficial ownership thing, where does a company like Moody's fit in?
Moody's, they play a big role. They're like a data provider, a real analytical powerhouse. They help those obliged entities meet all those new requirements, provide the tools they need to navigate this crazy, complex world. One tool they mention is this KYC API.
Okay, most people listening probably know about KYC, know your customer, but how does an API help uncover this hidden ownership info? Isn't KYC usually about like verifying someone's basic identity?
Yeah, usually KYC is about the basics, making sure things check out. But this KYC API, it digs deeper,
Ah, I see.
pulls data from all those commercial registries almost instantly, gives those obliged entities a much faster way to check a client's background, see if there are any red flags.
So instead of waiting weeks for paperwork, they get a quick snapshot of what the company looks like, huh?
Exactly. Time is money, right? Especially in
Yeah.
business.
Makes total sense. But that's just the first step, right? To untangle those ownership chains, especially when you're dealing with international stuff, you need something stronger. Something like, well, Moody's mentions this Orbis database.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so tell me, what is Orbis? How does it help crack this case of the hidden beneficial owner?
Orvis is kind of like, you have this map, a global map of corporate ownership right at your fingertips.
Okay.
It's got tons of data on all these entities, beneficial ownership info, the whole shebang. Think of it like a detective's toolkit. Helps you piece together all those ownership structures, trace those connections, even across different countries.
So, like, if I'm a compliance officer at a bank, right,
Right.
and I'm looking at a potential client and something feels off, I can use Orbis to see if there are any, like, hidden connections or red flags I should be worried about.
Exactly. Orbis can map out those super complicated chains of ownership,
Hmm.
shows you visually who's really in control, even if they're buried under layers of like subsidiaries or shell companies.
That's pretty powerful stuff. But wouldn't doing a deep dive like that take forever? I mean, we're talking about sifting through a ton of data, right?
Well, yeah, in the past, it would have been a huge time suck. But Orbis, it's got these really sophisticated search and filtering tools,
Hmm.
makes the whole process way more efficient. You can zero in on the info you need, save a ton of time and resources.
So Orbis is like a supercharged Google for corporate ownership.
Yeah,
Nice.
something like that.
Okay, but let's go back to those obliged entities for a minute. We've talked about banks, crypto companies, even football clubs. But the list, it's pretty diverse. Why those groups specifically? What connects them?
It all comes down to, well, the potential for money laundering. These are areas where, dirty money could be injected into the legitimate economy.
So it's not just about catching the actual criminals, but also making it way harder for them to clean their dirty money.
Exactly. By making all these different businesses follow AMLD6, the EU is basically making it much tougher for criminals to find, safe havens for their ill-gotten gains, closing those loopholes, you could say.
Right, shutting down those escape routes.
Okay, but let's shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about tech and regulations, but this all comes down to people, right?
Definitely. At the end of the day, it's humans making decisions.
Right. Like they say, a fool with a tool is still a fool. You need someone who knows what they're doing, who can look at the data and actually understand it.
100%.
Yeah.
And that's something Moody's does really well. They don't just throw data at you. They offer analysis, insights. They help you make sense of it all.
Got it. So it's this combo of like really powerful tech and actual human expertise. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. Privacy. I mean, we're collecting all this personal information. How do we make sure it's used responsibly, that people's rights are protected? That's a huge point. And honestly, it's a tough balancing act. We want to make things transparent, expose those hidden owners, make it harder for the bad guys to hide. But we don't want to create this like surveillance state where everyone's info is just out there for anyone to see.
Yeah, that's a fine line to walk. And that European Court of Justice ruling, it really showed how important privacy is in all this. How's that ruling changed the way these beneficial ownership registers are managed?
That ruling, it was a big deal. A lot of EU countries had to like slam the brakes on public access to the registers, make sure they were in line with the court's decision.
So it's created some gaps in the data, but AMLD6 tries to deal with this with, what do they call it? Legitimate interest access, right?
Yeah, AMLD6 tries to find a middle ground. The idea is only people with a real genuine need for the info can get it. like law enforcement, those obliged entities doing due diligence, maybe some journalists and researchers.
But I mean, legitimate interest, that sounds pretty vague, right?
Huh.
Who gets to decide what that means? What's to stop someone from just, like, abusing that access?
That's the tricky part. There's still a lot of debate about this, and different countries are doing things differently. Some are being really strict, others are trying to stay more open. It's complicated, for sure. No easy answers.
So it's kind of a gray area, and a lot depends on how individual countries decide to implement these rules. Sounds like a potential minefield for companies that operate in multiple countries, especially with all the different data privacy laws out there.
Absolutely. Companies really need to be on top of this. Clear guidelines, strong compliance procedures, and I think a real understanding of the ethics involved.
Well, this is definitely giving me a lot to think about. It's
Yeah.
obvious this whole beneficial ownership thing, it's a complex issue, constantly evolving, and we've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface. What else should our listeners be aware of?
It feels like, I don't know, we've gone down this rabbit hole, and honestly, I'm kind of loving it.
Right. We've talked about all these shady ownership setups, global regulations, even like star athletes may be caught up in this whole beneficial ownership web. But I have a feeling we're not done yet, are we?
Oh no, not even close.
Yeah.
Especially in a field like this, things are always changing. One area that's really fascinating is how all this new tech is playing a role. We talked about the tools. Moody's is using the KYC API, Orbis, all that. But there's a whole wave of new tech coming, stuff that could completely change how we approach this whole beneficial ownership thing.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What kind of tech are we talking about? Is this where like AI steps in and starts analyzing board meetings, figures out who's really calling the shots?
AI is definitely part of it, yeah. Imagine these algorithms that can analyze huge amounts of data, find these subtle patterns of control that, human analysts might miss. We're also seeing some really cool advancements in data visualization, making it easier to see those complex ownership structures we've been talking about.
So instead of staring at spreadsheets, we could have these like interactive maps showing all the connections between companies and people. It'd be like something out of a spy movie.
Exactly. And then there's blockchain technology. That has the potential to completely revolutionize how we record and verify ownership information.
Okay, I know blockchain is the tech behind cryptocurrencies, but how would that work for beneficial ownership? I don't quite get it.
So imagine a system where all the beneficial ownership data is stored on a blockchain. It'd be super secure, completely transparent, and most importantly, tamper-proof.
Ah, okay.
So authorized people could access it, but if anyone tried to mess with the data, it'd be obvious right away.
Yeah.
No more hiding.
So no more hiding behind shell companies or using all those legal loopholes to obscure who owns what. That sounds amazing.
Well-
Almost too good to be true. But what about like the practical side of things? Would every company in the world have to switch to this blockchain system?
It's early days for this tech, yeah. But the potential is huge. It could become the gold standard, the way we track beneficial ownership all over the world. And if that happens, it'd be a lot harder for the bad guys to hide.
That would be a game changer. But I mean, any new tech comes with risks, right?
Ugh.
What are the downsides here? What should we be thinking about?
Well, data security is a big one. If all this sensitive information is stored digitally, it becomes a target for hackers.
Makes sense.
Imagine what could happen if that data fell into the wrong hands.
Oh, it doesn't bear thinking about. We've all seen what happens when hackers get hold of personal data. Identity theft, financial fraud, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. So as we start using these new technologies, cybersecurity has to be a top priority. We need strong security measures, encryption, and strict access controls. Can't take any chances.
And we can't forget about privacy either. How do we make sure this tech is being used ethically, that it doesn't erode people's rights?
Absolutely. That's something we need to be really careful about. We need clear rules and regulations about how this data is collected, stored, and used. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot between transparency and privacy. That's been a key theme throughout our deep dive, hasn't it?
It has. We can't just sacrifice one for the other. It's about using this powerful tech responsibly while still upholding ethical principles.
Well said. And as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. This whole idea of transparency and beneficial ownership, it's not just about catching criminals. It's about building a fairer, more accountable system for everyone.
It's about lifting the curtain, showing everyone how things really work, demanding that the people who benefit from the system play by the rule.
Exactly. It's a journey, and it takes effort from all of us. We need to stay vigilant, keep asking questions, and never stop pushing for a more transparent and accountable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I've learned a ton today, honestly. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating and slightly mind-bending world.
It's been my pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep digging, keep exploring, and keep fighting for a better system. That's what it's all about.